People who become newly wealthy often think that private banking is the best place to affirm their newly minted status. And yet what they often end up with is bad rates and a lot of bad deals. Today, I'm going to tell you why private banking is often a scam to be avoided. So let's talk about what private banking is. A lot of what you've seen marketed that you might think is private banking probably isn't. Anything targeted towards the mass affluent, where you're talking about a couple $100,000 in deposits, generally is not going to be private banking. And so if you look at the United States, for example, where I'm from, you're not going to see these $250,000 options. That's not private banking. Chase has an option called private wealth. I guess that's kind of private banking. And yet most of what you're seeing widely marketed at your local retail bank is not going to be it. Generally speaking, anything under $1 million will not be private banking. If you look at some of the best private banks, in people's opinion, from Coutts in the UK to UBS in Switzerland to Bank of Singapore to other smaller ones in Liechtenstein and Andorra and all around the world, you make it in like the Bahamas, for example, for $1 million. You're often in the more well-known jurisdictions going to be depositing $2, $3, $5, even $10 million. Heaven forbid you end up with HSBC's private bank. Well, that's just because heaven forbid you ever wind up with HSBC. What I generally tend to favor is what I would call a priority bank, where you can get in for the 6 figures or maybe the lower 7 figures. You're going to get much of the same service. You're going to have much of the same great banks available to you. You have a wider number of banks available to you on a more transactional level that somewhat leave you alone. Some of those banks, however, and many of the private banks where they want higher numbers are going to almost push you to say, why aren't you moving all of your funds here? Now at Nomad Capitalist, one of the things we help our clients do is open bank accounts around the world legally. And so they're not looking to put all their funds in at first. I mean, we'll talk to people who are deca-millionaires and they're like, hey, listen, can I move 50 grand somewhere? And I have to kind of encourage them, like, well, let's move it up a little bit just to give you some decent options. Yes, you can get bank accounts around the world for $1,000. I mean, in places like Georgia, you can do that. But if you have a significant amount of money, you probably want to get into at least the 6 figures. And so knowing myself and how I've, over the years, wanted to dip a toe in when first diversifying overseas, knowing many of the clients that we work with who could afford to put in more but like to start small, it is very frustrating when you go to, again, the higher level priority banks and certainly private banks, and they kind of scoff at you that you don't want to just put in millions of dollars right away. And I've seen through my own negative experiences with some of these banks, I had one in Liechtenstein, for example, I couldn't get them to return my emails. And when I asked them just straight up, like, hey, how long should I expect to get a response from you guys? They're like, sometimes an hour and sometimes a few weeks. And I just said, like, that's really a lot worse than the service I would receive from many of the priority banks. Heck, that's worse than the service I would receive from like a regular retail bank in many cases. And so they're often asking you to put more and more and more of your money in. And my philosophy is you don't want all your money in any one anything, any one bank, any one asset class, again, anything. For whatever amount of cash I want to keep, I am a believer in having cash. I think opportunities come up, emergencies happen. There's all kinds of reasons to have cash. A bit more reasons now as there are, there's a little bit of a yield to be had on that cash. But I'm never going to put all my cash into one bank, and I'm not going to let a banker push me to do that. But private bankers are more likely to do that because there's this idea that they put in your head, much like somebody, it was a Pretty Woman, where you go to the Gucci store, the Louis Vuitton store, where they almost have to be condescending for you, to where you're like, all right, I'll show you, I'll buy more of your product. I mean, Shaquille O'Neal talked about that. He went looking for cars. I'm not going to spend that much. They said, oh, you can't spend that much. Maybe you don't have the money. He's like, I'll show you. I'll buy 3 of your most expensive car, $1.2 million. That's kind of how it works. And yet you don't want to be the person who, Shaquille O'Neal spends the $1.2 million. He's out $1.2 million. You may not be out the money, but you have more risk having all your money in one bank, whether that bank fails, as we've seen a number of those banks fail recently, or whether it's just, hey, there's an opportunity cost, or your banker just decides, today 5 million doesn't please me, so maybe an hour, maybe a few weeks. Now, I'm sure there's some guy in Switzerland watching this, maybe that guy who talks like Luigi, who's going to tell you, like, he doesn't understand Swiss banks. Now, I have not tried every single Swiss bank or every single private bank around the world. There are some that I can't qualify for because I don't have the right tax residence. There are some that really only want you if you're living in the West. There are some that are really restrictive on who gets in, some that are by referral only. If you are an American, there'll be certain ones that want you but not me. There'll be many that don't want you. If you live in Western countries, you will have more options. If I were to live in a Western country as a tax resident, there would be more options, but many of the jurisdictions like Switzerland almost look askance at like certain citizenships. And I say, listen, I'm not going to change my diversification strategy to suit a Swiss banker when I can go to Singapore or I can go to the Bahamas or I can go to any number of other places. I'm not going to change what I want to do in my life or what I'm doing tactically to protect my interests to suit your outdated notions. And so Switzerland, Monaco, I just found go where you're treated best applied. The attitude, the legwork. I literally created a 7-page document that I take into any bank now that answers every question I know they're going to have because we know all the questions they ask. We know tax residence and all this kind of stuff, CLNs for former US citizens. And even that doesn't always work. So I've asked myself, why put yourself through so much work? Yes, there'll be someone who said, oh, it's so easy to bank in Switzerland. There's Noah Kagan made a video about this, and how he ran all around Switzerland and finally got one bank to take him. What I don't like, and what I think people who are newly affluent fall for, is the why don't you put more? My philosophy is, listen, I'm going to do what I want to do. If your minimum's $1 million, that's how much I'm putting in. And there's almost a thought like, well, only what? Like, I want to see how you perform and how you serve me. I've had banks where they're just like, you know what? We're closing everyone's account right now. And so there was one where for a couple of months I couldn't access my money. It wasn't much, but if I would have listened to them and, oh, just move all your money over, we'll take care of you, I would have been screwed. And so one of the things we try and help our clients with is sharing our experiences. Banking is always changing, but if we have banks that are a pain to deal with, we're going to tell you, hey, listen, here's banks that are a pain to deal with. And there's always some bank, there was one that was like, oh, we're super crypto friendly. And it was just so impossible to deal with them and so slow. And so sometimes banks work and then eventually they become harder to deal with. And that's what we keep our clients updated on. Other things you're going to be frustrated with private banks is there's a lot more due diligence. And so a priority bank account is going to give you a lot of the access to services without not only upfront due diligence, but ongoing due diligence. And so in some cases, they'll make you go through a review every year. Even if you can pass that, they're going to ask you to provide them some, like, it's going to become a process. And so for someone who wanted to get away from being in the paperwork game, I just said, well, wait a second. I can bank with some of the same banks that do private banking. I can bank with the priority one. I can have more flexibility. Maybe some of what I do is self-serve, which I almost prefer. You do your KYC on me up front. Maybe you ask me some questions occasionally, but I'm not going through like an annual strenuous review. There is a bank where I have an account, which kind of speaks to why I think building tunnels in smaller bank accounts is a valuable thing. I opened an account in Singapore over a decade ago. And at the time, it only took $1,000 to open that account. I have more than that now, but I guess I could have as little as 1,000 Singapore dollars. You cannot get an account at that bank anymore. They don't want anybody unless you live in Singapore. And they will not upgrade my account either. When I went in to talk about upgrading my account, I said, hey, listen, I can bring in more money. They're like, tell me what you did in 2005. Oh, you had a job in university? What was that about? Do you have your tax returns? And I'm like, I don't think so. They're like, tut tut. And they ultimately like, we don't feel comfortable if you can't show us the, Wendy's you worked at in 2001. Like, oh, not interested. And I just said, okay, like they do them and I'm going to do me. And I've just found that a lot of the private banks, it's a lot of ongoing hassle. The services I mentioned, you think it's better. None of us are in love with bankers, let's be honest, unless it's the one or two that we have working here. But the service in private banks I have found in both opening the account is either non-existent, they just ignore you. You would think if you have $5 million to put in an account, that they would respond. They don't. And again, it's kind of like the Gucci store. Except I really realized why this doesn't work when we had a client who has a net worth of about $500 million. And he said he was rebuffed by many of the banks and sometimes ignored. He said it was almost like converting to Judaism. It's like they had to reject me a bunch of times before they could finally say yes. And so we were able to connect him with some folks who were able to facilitate, like, okay, dude, like this guy's clean and he's got $500 million. Maybe we should take this guy. I had a Swiss bank once that like yelled at me. They're like, where are you living? And at the time I was kind of living in Georgia, the country. And they're like, we don't take Americans. And I'm like, not American. And they just basically wanted to be disagreeable. That's what I've historically found. Now, what you're also going to find at these private banks is slower fills on trades, higher commissions. if you like to manage your own portfolio, you will hate private banking because they're going to be like, they don't want you just to store your cash there. For me, a bank is a place where you park cash. And if you want to buy property, if you want to invest back in your business, if you want to do whatever, you leave it there. Yes, I like keeping cash. Some of it could just be in a simple term deposit, making some money. But even the Asian private banks, which I think are more transactional, lower fees, much more so than the Swiss banks, which are just basically charging you for the brand and then not delivering, you're going to pay more. If you're used to using just a regular brokerage account, understand if you go offshore, you're going to pay higher commissions than you would in the US, where the game now is basically zero commission. But you're going to pay insane money management fees, commissions, everything else, and then they're going to try and push all their exotic stuff on you. What I described private banking as is basically a social proof funnel, where the fact that you think of them as so, exciting and private banking and it's fancy, they're going to use that to sell you everything from buying debt in a Burger King franchise chain in Turkey to buying all of their exotic financial products. And I just think most people don't want that. Yes, there are some private banks that offer private equity. I know I'm going to get comments saying, oh, he's not sophisticated enough. You can get a lot of this stuff without going through a private bank and paying a bunch of extra money, and they don't even serve you properly. I can tell you, we have clients with $100 million plus, and they just don't get served by these banks. I've heard very few positive stories. I've heard a few, and those are some of the banks that we do work with on the private banking side, and we do send our clients to. But you're just going to pay a lot more. Now, there's also some things that they'll offer you that you might think are interesting that you probably don't want a bank for, whether it's a private bank or any other bank. Number one, managing a portfolio if you want to do that yourself. Not everyone can. But I have a friend who's a great investor, and he said, there's a certain way bankers invest. And it's not the way great investors invest. They invest like bankers, right? I mean, they're not the great investors. They're not wealthy, right? It's kind of like those who can't teach. The other thing you shouldn't do, in my opinion, is store gold in the bank. Number one, if you're a U.S. citizen, assets in foreign financial institutions are reportable. Privately vaulted precious metals may not be. And so there's potentially that issue for some folks reporting. There's also, what if there's a bank holiday? What if the bank has an issue? Now your gold's in there rather than if you have it in a private vault where it's segregated and allocated. Now, a lot of people want to open offshore bank accounts, including private bank accounts, and they think it's just like going down the street to their local bank. That's not true. And so people often ask us here at Nomad Capitalist, why don't you offer an a la carte service offering opening bank accounts? And the reason now is because most companies that do that generally don't deliver. We have a lot of clients coming saying, I hired some offshore consultant and they claim to open bank accounts, and I had the hell of a time getting it open, because it's not as easy as just saying, here's the name of a bank, we'll open for everybody. Everyone's situation is different, and the bank views every situation is different. And so what we'll often do now is, especially on the corporate side, but even on the personal side, we might have to look at half a dozen different banks that we screen for you. And even then, you'll pick 3 of them, and we'll say, okay, our goal is to get 2. Because one, you just might get someone, even if we know them, who's like, we don't like this one thing about you. And how could we predict that? So just putting up a list of bank names on your website and saying, hey, come and give us $2,000 and we'll open this one, it generally doesn't work. And I can tell you, there's companies in Hong Kong that will offer to incorporate your company and then open an account for you. Where? HSBC, the same place that de-risked every non-resident in like 2015 or 2016. There are people in Hong Kong who are still selling bank account opening services at a bank that has not accepted those people for close to a decade. But if you haven't done this, you wouldn't know that. That's what Nomad Capitalist does. Obviously, occasionally we have trouble getting people bank accounts, but generally speaking, taking this broader approach and seeing bank accounts in the context of a broader plan of asset protection, diversification, tax savings, what have you, is a lot more efficient than just offering an off-the-shelf a la carte service. That's what we do at Nomad Capitalist. If you are a 7 or 8 figure entrepreneur investor, we can help you look at the whole picture, whether it's asset protection, tax savings, what have you. Just opening a bank account, by the way, overseas does not reduce your taxes. It does, in many cases, add a form you need to file to report that, and we suggest people follow that. But you don't want to get a private bank account where they just want to use your relationship as an excuse to sell you expensive stuff. There are a few good ones, and we can help you get connected with those. We're going to be talking about bank accounts at Nomad Capitalist Live, by the way, which is our annual live event. So if you're just starting this and you're not sure, like, hey, I don't know if I want to be a client because you're not quite sure what all the options are, come to Nomad Capitalist Live. It's our live event. But my opinion, quite frankly, having worked with actual clients, again, including some very, very wealthy people, is oftentimes better to start with a little bit smaller service just to reduce the footprint, just to reduce the ongoing effort, You might get the same level of service, and you probably want to segregate your banking services. The private banking model is almost like we have one financial partner. I wouldn't get in bed with just one private bank. I'd have my brokerage account over here. I'd have a bank account over here. I'd have another one over here. I'd have retail banking where I pay my bills separately from where I'm storing my cash. I want to put together, not only for diversification purposes, but for logistics purposes, numerous different banks and brokerages, and also precious metals if I want that, and also crypto if I want that. It should not be all in one place. The more services a bank fulfills, fine. But assuming one bank's going to do everything, to me, is dangerous. That's the pitch of private banking. I found it doesn't deliver.